Hello, everybody. It's great to be part of SOCIA and to be opening this symposium on astrobiology. My name is Nathalie Gonje, and I work at the University of Lisbon in the Center for Philosophy of Science. And I'm going to be giving a talk on the mode and tempo of the evolution of life on Earth and possibly elsewhere. The distinction between the mode and the tempo of evolution is a distinction that was made by George Gaylord Simpson, who was one of the founders of the modern synthesis. And so with the mode of evolution, he wanted to describe the way, the manner, or the pattern whereby evolution by means of natural selection occurs. And the tempo, with that, he described the rate or the pace of whereby evolution occurs. So we're going to be looking into that, and we're also going to be looking into depictions of both that mode and tempo of evolution. And more specifically, we're going to be looking into tree models and timelines and also networks. And we're going to be analyzing that from within three different paradigms: the paradigm of the modern synthesis, the extended synthesis, and also a movement that is called the third way of evolution. And we're going to look into how these theories help to define how life evolves on Earth and possibly elsewhere. So let's start by looking at the Darwinian synthesis. So according to the founders of the modern synthesis, and thereby of course following Darwin, evolution occurs by means of natural selection. So natural selection is the mechanism whereby evolution occurs. And then it is argued that selection operates on the organism at the level of the environment. And natural selection is defined as a gradual process. And so for Darwin, natural selection is a mechanism that explains the origin and evolution of species. And the origin and evolution of species he understood from within the differential survival of organisms. And in many ways, natural selection theory is a theory that looks into anatomical form and how it evolves in organisms. But Darwin also investigated how natural selection can be applied to the study of behavior. And in that regard, for example, he also examined the phenomenon of sexual selection. And so implementing natural selection theory into the study of behavior eventually founded ethology. And then at the Chicago Darwin Centennial, it was especially Julian Huxley that went one step further, and he argued for the universalization of natural selection and the universalization of Darwinism. And with that, he meant that natural selection theory could also be applied to the study of culture and to the study of language. And then several years later, natural selection theory was also successfully implemented in these fields, as well as in the study of molecular genetics. There, scholars started to investigate how genes evolve by means of natural selection. And also in cosmology, there have been studies that examine how natural selection theory can be applied to explain the origin of different universes. And so in this regard, scholars have been debating what can be universal units of natural selection, and they have also been debating how natural selection can operate on different phenomena. So how it can operate on the evolution of species, on languages, cultures, etc. And so in that regard, examples of universal units that have been proposed are the replicators and the memes as they were introduced by Richard Dawkins, culture genes, and also Hull's interactors. And then examples of universal formulas, well, there have been many definitions of what natural selection is and how it operates. And the most popular one is the one introduced by Lewontin, which is phenotypic variation, differential fitness, and heritability of that fitness. And these three these days are called the Darwinian principles, and they are especially applied within cultural and linguistic evolutionary research. And then if we look into how evolution is depicted, then it is mostly depicted into timelines and trees. Now, Darwin himself, he introduced this diagram that we see on the right in his book on the origin of species, and he never called this diagram a tree of life. For him, what is represented was how species gradually, over time, evolve by splitting off from existing lineages. And so for him, each one of these lines depicted 10,000 years or more, And for him, evolution was a very gradual process and it was a very uniform process. And that has also been used to depict evolution into timelines where on a timeline going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, evolutionary events are depicted to occur steadily over time. Now, one of the problems that arises by understanding evolution in linear terms is that it brings forth a notion of progress. So when only uh, species evolve that are adapted to the environment, then that means that the maladapted are weeded out, that they will go extinct, but then only the fit survive. And that is also how Spencer, for example, understood natural selection. He understood it as the survival of the fittest. And as such, you get the idea that evolution leads to progress and to ever better adapted species. And so that is an issue that is not always correct and that has also been attacked by Stephen Jay Gould in several of his publications. And this idea of linearity is also something that has been very inspirational for early science fiction work. For example, in Star Trek, you see that often that when the Star Trek crew arrives at a different planet, the idea is put forward that that planet is sometimes inhabited by a people or a culture that is still considered to be in a hunter-gathering phase or in an agricultural phase or in a de-weaponized phase. And as such, it is implied that there exist these phases, these developmental stages that are natural to any kind of evolutionary process. Now, this idea goes back to very old theories that were first developed by moral philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Auguste Comte or Thomas Hobbes and David Hume, where when looking into Western history, scholars started to look into the different stages of historical development. And that stage thinking was then evolutionized and it was understood as stages that necessarily lead to the evolution of modern societies. And so this is one of the problems that we find to be criticized today also within anthropological research, because today there still exist cultures that are hunter-gatherers or that are mostly organized around farming within even the human species, but that does not mean that these people are somehow stuck in time or that they are underdeveloped. So we have to be very cautious in how we formulate these ideas, or we bring forth and we intensify existing racial and also racist theories. And here's another problem. If you understand evolution as a leveling up, then extinction would have been something that occurred more in the past than that it occurs today, because the species alive today would have been alive because they had stand the test of time, because they are somehow adapted. Because if only organisms that are adaptive survive and only the fit survive, to say it with Spencer, then today, after many millions of years of evolution, the question would be, why is there even extinction? So if you look into evolution as a diagram, you would have to see maximal diversity of species at the end of the tree of life. And that, however, is something that is not there. When people depict the evolution of species over millions of years, then what you get is a pattern that is equal to the right. So you see a maximum diversity not at the end of the tree, but what you see is the survival of certain lineages over others. And that brings us to the next point. And that brings us to the study of punctuated equilibria. And the study of punctuated equilibria associates with the idea that a modern synthesis is unfinished, and that then associates with the idea that the modern synthesis needs to be extended. So let's look into that now. So punctuated equilibria is a pattern that we find in the fossil record, and it was first described by Niles Eldredge and Stephen G. Gould in the context of the Cambrian explosion, which is the origin of most multicellular life forms, and the fossils that they left in the Burgess Shale in the Canadian Rockies. So the Cambrian explosion associates with a period in time 541 million years ago, where we see the rise of the major phyla, the thick branches of a tree of life, and that associates with the origin of the different body plans that we find within multicellular life. So at that time, life has already evolved, and it has already had a very complex evolution of unicellular organisms, of archaea and bacteria, which we know that were the first life forms, and they have been evolving for many, many millions of years, and they are very diverse as a group. The species concept does not really apply to them, but they are very diverse. But so what happens with the Cambrian explosion is that multicellular life has evolved, and then that multicellular life starts to get different shapes and sizes. So the phyla, the body plans evolve. And so what is so special about these different body plans is that they evolve very rapidly within the fossil record. They just appear to pop up all of the sudden. And ever since, there has also never been such a diversity in body plans evolving anymore. And so that is what punctuated equilibria is about. It is a theory about the tempo and the pattern of evolution that says that evolution is not always a gradual process. Rather, long periods of stasis are sometimes intermitted by short periods of rapid change. And so that rapid change then is characterized by rapid speciation or extinction of a single species or even groups of species that is then intermitted by long periods of stasis. And this stasis involves the fact that sometimes there does not appear to be morphological change or not a lot of morphological change going on within an existing species or a group of species. And then going back to this Cambrian explosion, where we see the rise of this multicellular life, what we see is that the diversity of body plans is something that we find at the bottom of the tree. And then what happens is that is what Gould calls a decimation. There is a decimation of the kinds of body plans that exist. Only a couple of these survive, but then what we see is an enormous diversity of species of a certain body type. And so that is also the pattern of punctuated equilibria, because this burst of multicellular life forms was later on decimated, and then we find this diversity within a couple of branches, within a couple of phyla. And then the question, of course, is why? Why did some lineages make it over others? And then Stephen Jay Gould is very famous for saying that it was contingency. Some of these lineages just got lucky and others were unlucky. And if we would rewind the tape of life, we would have different winners in the struggle for existence and survival. While Simon Conway Morris says that there is convergent evolution, that we find convergence in evolutionary stages and development. And what I think is very interesting is that the pattern of punctuated equilibria appears to be universal. So let's look into that. The pattern of punctuated equilibria is also found within hominin evolution. So human evolution used to be understood in gradual and in linear terms. So the idea was that Homo habilis evolved into Homo erectus, who evolved into Homo sapiens. But today, many more different kinds of fossils have been found, and they have been classified as different species by splitters, and they oppose themselves to the lumpers that used to think in gradual, that used to understand human evolution in gradual terms. So what they do, these splitters, is they recognize the existence of 24 and perhaps even more species, and so the image then that we get of human evolution is not one where there is a linear and a gradual evolution. Instead, there is paraphyla, there are a lot of sister taxa, and there is no linear evolution towards humankind. And the pattern of punctuated equilibria can also be found in the archaeological record of material cultural remains. So if you look into the evolution of hominins, there associates with that an evolution in tool technologies and in tool industries. And the earliest tool industries, such as the older one that is found in Africa, and also bifaces, these are produced by several of these hominins. And what is interesting there is that they do not appear to undergo much change in design for the hundreds of thousands of years that they are being produced by these different hominins. However, with the rise of the Middle Stone Age, and especially during the Upper Paleolithic, we can find a burst of creativity. And so we find the introduction of microliths and of different kinds of ornamentation and of artwork. And so here, all of a sudden, then we find a rapid pace of cultural innovation. And the pattern of punctuated equilibria has also been found at a molecular level when people study gene trees, and also when people model the evolution of different languages. There too, we can find the pattern of punctuated equilibria within certain language families. So it is safe to say that the pattern of punctuated equilibria is also universal. It is universal here on Earth because it can be detected within the evolution of biological organisms, but also within the evolution of culture and languages. And so it is something that can be extrapolated also when we study how life possibly evolves outside of Earth in the universe. And so there too, we need to assume that there can be periods of rapid evolution and periods of stasis. And so far we have been looking into some of the tenets of the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, and we have been looking into the idea that that synthesis is unfinished and that it needs to be extended. But in recent years, there is also a movement that is called the third way of evolution. Now let's look into that. And the third way of evolution builds upon the idea that the modern synthesis is unfinished and that it needs to be extended. But the third way in specific also recognizes the importance of reticulate evolution, mobile genetic elements, physiology, and drift. And so what is reticulate evolution? Reticulate evolution is evolution as it occurs by means of symbiogenesis or symbiosis, hybridization, lateral gene transfer, and infectious heredity. And so what combines all these different forms of reticulate evolution is that the lineages can cross. So neo-Darwinian evolutionary theories understand the evolution of species as a process of ramification, as a tree of life where the branches of the tree split into different branches. Reticulate evolution, however, understands evolution as a process where the lineages of a tree of life can cross and merge. And what is interesting here is that all forms of reticulation occur rapidly, and they can also be responsible for rapid evolutionary change. So an example here is viral colonization. All life forms are prone to viral infections. And so what happens during a viral infection is that a virus is able to transmit its genes to the recipient. And that recipient then can respond in very different ways. Either the recipient dies or it is able to fence off the virus. But sometimes viruses are also able to stay dormant and to maintain a symbiotic association with their host. And then when that happens, these genes can potentially be passed on from one generation to the next. And as such, they lead to rapid evolutionary change. And what is interesting is that the first life forms, bacteria and also archaea, don't even need viruses as vectors for gene transportation. They can freely transmit genes between one another. Now, the idea of colonization is something that has, of course, been featured a lot in science fiction movies and in science fiction series. The idea that they somehow already walk amongst us. Now, that takes on very different proportions. Sometimes it implies an idea of possession. Sometimes there is the idea, like you see, of an invasion of the body snatchers. But all of that would imply that there is some kind of genetic basis for that, and that would then imply some kind of horizontal transfer. Also, there are scholars on a scientific level that think that viruses have origin outside of Earth and that also the genetic code evolved prior to the evolution of life on Earth. And so, in that regard, the idea of colonization and of genetic colonization and viral colonization is being taken seriously at a scientific level. And in that regard, also the theme of hybridization has featured in science fiction literature and in science fiction movies. But in that regard, I think scientifically speaking, it would be less likely that there is hybridization between life as we know it on Earth and life as it would evolve on other planets. That, of course, does not mean that hybridization is not an important evolutionary mechanism. Quite the contrary. We now know that hybridization has played an important role in the evolution of plants, but also in the evolution of animals. And in that regard, also our own species, we now know, has hybridized several times over with different hominin species, such as Denisovans and Neanderthals, and also unknown hominin species. So we have genetic material that we know that has introgressed at one point, but we do not know exactly yet which species it came from. In that regard, then, when we think about hybridization, we must recognize it as an important evolutionary mechanism. And also, when we think about how life evolves on other planets, there too, one of the ways by which it can evolve is by means of hybridization. But that does not necessarily imply that life on other planets would also be able to hybridize with life as we know it on Earth. If it would, then that would imply that there was a strong convergence and that there is a lot of genetic similarity between life on Earth and life elsewhere. And then another way whereby reticulate evolution can occur is by means of symbiosis and symbiogenesis. And so symbiosis is an ecological phenomenon that refers to the living together of unlike named organisms. And symbiogenesis is symbiosis gone hereditary. So we know that symbiosis and especially symbiogenesis has played an important role in the evolution of mitochondria and chloroplasts, which are organelles that we find inside of eukaryotic organisms. But symbiosis and symbiogenesis continue to play an important role in the evolution of life insofar as they underlie holobiont formation. So the human, for example, maintains a very strong relationship, a symbiotic relationship with its microbiome and also with its viriome. And so what happens there is that a human being plus its microbiome and plus its viriome becomes a holobiont, a new biological individual. And that new individual also functions as a new habitable zone of life. And that is something that I think is sometimes ignored in the literature. Scholars look for new territory outside in outer space. And in that regard, they often forget that multicellular organisms often already are a habitable zone of life. And also, symbiosis has featured heavily in science fiction movies. And symbiosis itself is a neutral term. It does not specify the nature of the living arrangement. And so it can be negative. Symbiosis can be understood as a form of parasitism, or it can be positive, and then symbiosis can be understood as a form of mutualism and as a form of commensalism. And one of the questions that I have then been asking myself in several of my publications is how can we also universalize symbiosis and symbiogenesis? Is there a way to also universalize it just as natural selection has been universalized? And I think, of course, that there is, and there Margulis also leads us the way. So one of the things that she did was she defined at one point symbiogenesis as individuality through incorporation. And I think that in and of itself is already a good way to think about how symbiosis and symbiogenesis could occur within domains other than biological ones. So, for example, when we think about technological evolution or cultural evolution, and also when we think about how life could possibly evolve symbiogenetically on other planets, that would involve some kind of individuality through incorporation. Now, the concept of universal symbiogenesis was first introduced by Freeman Dyson, and I have also been, based upon his definition, involved in defining universal symbiogenesis, and I define it as the irreversible process whereby new entities are introduced because of the horizontal mergings between different previously independently existing entities. And then possible universal units of symbiosis could be the symbionts, the entities that engage in a symbiosis, holobionts, and also the symbiome. And the symbiome is a concept introduced by Jan Sapp to also emphasize the ecological aspects that surround holobiont formation. And so examples of universal reticulation are, of course, forms of cultural blending or multiculturalism. Ideas, religious ideas, political ideas, cultural ideas are known to uh, evolve reticulately. Alfred Gruber, for example, one of the founders of American anthropology, already said that if you look into how cultural ideas spread geographically and also how they spread through time, then there what you see is a form of blending and a form of cultural diffusion that demonstrates reticulation. And at that point, he differentiated cultural evolution from biological evolution because he understood evolution in selectionist and in Darwinian terms as something that occurs through splitting. But so he said that cultural evolution demonstrates these forms of reticulation. And today, also language evolution makes use of these ideas of lineage crossing. And also, for example, the Indo-European language family tree has been shown to not only evolve by means of splitting, but there also word borrowing occurs, and it occurs quite frequently. And so the tree of the Indo-European language family is also something that demonstrates reticulation. So recapitulating, because we're coming to the end of my presentation, what have we been saying? So we started by looking into the nature of natural selection and how natural selection theory has been universalized first from biology to the sociocultural and the behavioral sciences and also the molecular sciences. And secondly, how that universalized form of natural selection has been used to think about life and how it possibly evolves on other planets. And the same can also be done with the pattern of punctuated equilibria. Also, stasis and rapid evolution is something that not only characterizes life, biological life, but also the material remains that life leaves. So also their cultural material remains, for example, demonstrate the pattern of punctuated equilibria. And also languages, communication systems demonstrate the pattern of punctuated equilibria. And also reticulation can be understood as something that occurs universally on Earth, not only within life, but also within culture and also within languages. So here too, it is something that can be extrapolated to other planets and other societies and their material culture. And so one of the things that we need to do is we need to find a way to deal with this diversity, not only within the evolution of life on Earth, but also intergalactically. We need to take into account this kind of diversity. And then in that regard, one of the things that I have also been doing is beyond thinking about how symbiosis and reticular evolution can be universalized, I have also been thinking about what would be an even more universal definition of evolution that would be equally applicable to discuss the evolution of life, the evolution of culture, the evolution of language, and also the evolution of life as it might possibly occur elsewhere. And that is something that I have been doing from within what I call applied evolutionary epistemology. And so here, this is a theory of mine where I have been introducing and defining evolution differentially, not as that what occurs by means of natural selection, but for me, a universal definition of evolution is evolution occurs when units evolve at levels of an ontological hierarchy by mechanisms and processes. And so from this definition, then, we can derive a methodology, namely studying evolution, here or elsewhere, involves a search for units, levels, mechanisms, and processes, and allocating these into an ontological hierarchy. And so the keywords here then are units, levels, and mechanisms and processes. So these would be the ingredients or the basic elements that would need to be present in order to be able to talk about evolution here or anywhere elsewhere in the universe. And so the unit is what evolves, it is the entity that evolves, the level is where, it is the locus where evolution occurs, and the mechanism is the how of evolution, it is the means and the conditions whereby this evolution would occur. And so when these three together are present, we could talk about evolution. And so with these thoughts, we have reached the end of my presentation. And I want to take the opportunity to thank, and very kindly so, Kelly, Neil, and also Teresa for her hospitality. And I hope to meet one day in person. Bye.